Welcome to an overview of anaerobic digestion. So anaerobic digestion is basically taking any sort of organic material. This can be food waste, manure, crops, wastewater sludge, algae, anything that has organic matter, and putting it into an anaerobic chamber, so without oxygen. Inside this anaerobic chamber, there's stepwise reactions that happens. First, we have hydrolysis, which breaks up. You can think of the broccoli being broken up into like a liquid where the fatty acids, you break it up into sugars and fatty acids. And then you have acidogenesis, where those sugars and fatty acids are broken up into alcohols, CO2 and hydrogen. And then acetogenesis, where the alcohols are further broken down into acetic acid, again, more CO2 and hydrogen. And then finally, methanogenesis, where methane is being produced. So what we have is actually a consortium of biogas. So from these reactions, gases are being produced and we capture that gas. And that gas mainly has methane in it. So that's 55 to 75% methane. It also has CO2. It also has some water vapor, some ammonia, some hydrogen sulfide, some hydrogen. And so all of that biogas then can be used as a renewable energy source. So you can put the biogas directly. Usually you should do some scrubbing of the H2S, which can be corrosive. But basically that biogas can go into an electric generator. It can be a combined heat and power generator, where then the heat from that generation, the electric generation process, is used then to heat the digester. Or you can actually scrub out the CO2, and that's using pressure swing absorption. So instead of having like 60% methane, it goes up to 99 to 100% methane. At that point, then you can compress it and use it just like you would any sort of natural gas. You can use it in a natural gas vehicle. You can put it into a natural gas pipeline. Basically, it makes it, natural gas is 99% methane. So basically, it makes it renewable natural gas. So again, there's various ways you can use it, or you can just heat it and use it directly as a heat source, the methane. And then what's left over from this process is a liquid fertilizer. So while the carbon has broken down, the nitrogen and the phosphorus have gone from being mainly in an organically bound form, like the broccoli with the nitrogen phosphorus there inside that broccoli, to a liquid form. And so you actually have a fertilizer that's high in nutrients, but has a lot less solids and has more of the nutrient dissolved in their plant available for uptake for fertilization. So this is an old technology. It's been used for a very long time ago. It was used actually in the ancient baths. It was used actually in London with the sewage treatment plants in the 1800s. So it's old. It's not something new, but it's something that we're using more and more, both as a technology to promote renewable energy as well as to deal with solid waste more effectively. It's applicable to all types of biomass. So again, you can think of it as a landfill. A landfill is basically a big digester. We basically cover up a landfill and biogas is actually produced. Again, that biogas can be scrubbed and used as a generator for heat, or we might just flare it so that methane isn't going into the environment. We use it at wastewater treatment facilities. There's about 1,500 wastewater treatment facilities in the US that actually they separate the liquids and the solids. And then those solids then go down into a digester and they produce energy. Again, they can use that electricity to run the pumps. For the wastewater treatment process. And then we can use them on farm. We mainly use them in dairy, but they're also in swine and poultry and other applications, where we have in the US, about 365 on-farm dairy manure digesters or animal-based digesters. And again, we can also use them for food waste. They can be by themselves or combined with other types of waste sources, whether it be wastewater, sludge, or manure, where again, we take that food waste and make renewable energy. So the benefits, again, it's non-intermittent renewable energy in the form of heat, electricity, or natural gas. It reduces methane emissions that would be released into the atmosphere. So again, if I have an uncovered manure lagoon, if it goes anaerobic, that methane is going to be produced naturally by putting a cover on it and capturing that methane. And even just if I flare it, but also if I use it for electricity generation or scrub it for renewable natural gas, then that's methane that doesn't get released into the environment. And instead it's the CO2. But you can think of that CO2 as the same CO2 from the corn from photosynthesis that then the cow ate the corn, and through defecation, then that manure went into the digester. So it's actually still part of our same generation. of carbon cycling. But when it is in the form of methane, again, that's much more powerful of a greenhouse gas. So we want to actually turn it back into CO2 through utilization. Again, we can process food waste and produce power from food waste, organic material that would otherwise go to landfills. And again, if we get that food waste from going to the landfill, then we can create a liquid fertilizer and solid-based fertilizer that can be treated and used for food production. Again, in the United States, we only have about 1,700 of these anaerobic digestion systems. The majority are at wastewater, but about 300 or so, 300 to 400 on-farm digesters. But if we look at Germany, they have over 10,000 on-farm digesters. Nepal, 200,000, India, 5 million, and China, over 40 million digesters. Again, in India and China, they're mainly small scale. So maybe a couple cows or a couple pigs, or even the waste from the humans, all go into kind of a family-based digester system. And then they're able to use the fertilizer on their crops. So the vision for the biogas market in 2014, the Obama administration put out a US biogas opportunities roadmap, where basically they said at this point we were at 265 ag-based digesters, but we could get up to 11,000 digesters with the technology that we have now. You know, they said it is achievable. And with those 11,000 digesters, we could power 3 million homes and reduce methane emissions by 54 million metric tons of CO2 equivalency, which is about taking 11 million passenger vehicles off the road. California, the White House hasn't really done so much in terms of incentives, but California has. And so California had a legislation where they wanted to reduce methane emissions by 40% by 2020. And again, if we look at kind of our methane emissions by source, we have methane emissions from natural gas and petroleums, from enteric fermentation. This is just the cows burping and farting, basically, from the landfills themselves. Again, methane is produced if we're not capturing and burning that. That's going into the atmosphere. Coal mining. But then with this manure management is part of that methane emissions. And so by covering those manure lagoons and utilizing that biogas for energy, they're reducing methane emissions. So California has put over $100 million in state funding of digester projects and over $150 million in matching funds for their cap and trade program, where a lot of these are actually going up to renewable natural gas for vehicle fuel. So if we look at the agricultural based digesters, we have several that are under construction, shut down, operational, mainly dairy, some chicken. But you can see we have a lot here in California. And we have others, again, where we have a lot of dairy facilities. So again, that biogas, as we said, the percentage about 50 to 70% methane. Again, we have our CO2, our hydrogen sulfide. Again, we're talking about 1,500 to 5,000 ppm. So that's 0.15 to 0.5%. So it's usually less than 1% of the biogas. But again, that hydrogen sulfide, you do need to remove it before you use it, because it can be corrosive to your engine. And you paid a lot of money probably for your electric generator, so you want to protect it. Again, our ammonia, it can be there as well. And then we often have water vapor. So usually we will do a little bit of drying. And again, that'll help with the corrosion. If we have it as a drier biogas, we'll have less corrosion if H2S is there. Because when H2S and water react, you get sulfuric acid. So again, if we think about a manure-based digester, we have our manure going into our digester. We have the biogas going into our cogeneration system, so a combined heat and power system. The heat can go back to the digester. The biogas, again, can be used for electricity offset in your own farm. Surplus electricity can be sold back to the grid on a power purchase agreement. And it can also have surplus heat. Usually the heat to heat the digester is we have plenty more heat available from the combined heat and power. So you can also use it to heat houses, to heat barns, and to heat other things with that excess heat. And then often after the digestion process, they'll separate the liquids and the solids. And so the liquid would then be sprayed onto the field, and those solids can then be, because again, they have like hardly any pathogens at this point. During that process, we basically destroy the pathogens during the digestion process, kind of like composting, which is an aerobic process, can actually lead to pathogen kill. So they can use those solids. Often they just use them on their farm for bedding. And then it just, when the bedding just goes back into the digestion system and rotates out. So they have this continual supply of bedding, which can be thousands of dollars a year if you buy your bedding from outside in the form of sand, wood chips, shavings, other inputs for bedding. Also, they can sell those solids. Again, you can put the solids on the field as well for fertilizer. There are these little cow pots you can buy that are actually the solids in a little bedding pot for nursery plants that come from digesters. So again, when we think about this digestion process, you can think about, we have those, again, those those cellulose, starch, proteins, fats, and oils. And what's different about digestion versus if you think about ethanol, we're only looking at the carbohydrates, right? Those sugars that are going to go into the ethanol. If we think about biodiesel, we're only thinking about those fats and oils that are going into the process for biodiesel. With anaerobic digestion, we can actually use all of it. So all of it can be broken down into these different organic acids. The only thing that can't be broken down is that lignin, those nature's glue. So that usually kind of goes through the process and just kind of stays static. But all the rest of the cellulose, the starch, the proteins, the oils and fats get broken down to these volatile organic acids, formic acid, acetic acid, propionic, butyric, and then some C5 and C6 carbon chains. And these acids then are used by methanogens to create the biogas. Again, there's some nutrients used for microbial growth, but most of the nutrients are available at the end for fertilization. And again, there's all kinds of different bacteria that go through each of those stepwise processes. So it's a consortium of bacteria. We need not just methanogens, but we need hydrolysis, acetogens. We need all of those bacteria. And again, often the hydrolysis can be this rate limiting step to get to these simple sugars. But it really depends on how complex your substrate is that you're coming in. So again, as we talked about, this just another way to look at it. Our complex polymers come in and our monomers come in, but there's actually two different ways in which we make methane. So once we get our monomers in here, our sugars, our fatty acids, and amino acids, we can actually produce methane through propionic butyric alcohols, and then it goes to acetate, and then we have the methanogenesis, right, through the acetate, which is our acetotrophic methanogens, okay? But we can also make it through hydrogenotrophic methanogens. And what the hydrogenotrophic methanogens do is they take that H2 and that CO2 and put them together to get CH4, okay? And normally in your digester, about 70 to 80% of your methane is gonna come through this acetate route, and about 20% is gonna come through this hydrogenotrophic route, okay? So there's two actually pathways, or two types. Again, there's many types of methanogens, but kind of two pathways that they can take in terms of producing that methane. Factors affecting anaerobic digestion, again, your feedstock material and consistency. This is a biological process, and these are lots of different microorganisms and bacteria that we have, so we need to keep them happy. We need to keep them with a consistent material. We need to keep them at a temperature. They actually like the temperature of our body because we have methanogens in our guts, and so do cows. So about 98 degrees Fahrenheit's pretty good. And so they can also run at a higher temperature. But again, if we go lower, they're just going to be slower. You need to think about the pH and alkalinity. Again, we want to keep the pH around 7. They don't like really low pHs or too high. You need to think about how long you're going to keep it in the digester. Often it can be 20 to 30 day retention time inside a typical dairy digester in the US. In Europe, they actually add a lot more corn silage, and that corn silage takes longer to break down than the manure, which has already been broken down in the cow's gut. So they often keep their digesters running for 50, 60, 70 days. And so again, the size of your digester based on what's your daily input, and then what sizes you're going to be, because you're going to be having something come in and something come out every day. So then you size your digester based on your retention time. Again, what's your influent feed rate? How often are you going to load a day? How much is being loaded every day? Again, if you are using dairy manure, you need to think about what are the cows being fed and how that might affect your digestion production. Again, usually these are mixed, not always, but if we are mixing, we need to think about how we're agitating and if we need to fix something on that motor, how are we going to access it? And again, we need to think about the water. The water that comes into the digester is just going right out. So if you can reduce your water use, then you're going to reduce the amount of retention time inside the digester. Well, same retention time, but you reduce the size of the digester. The other thing you can do is you can recirculate some of those solids if you want to kind of digest them a little bit more and let the liquids go through. Other considerations, again, the dilution factor. So if we think about how much you're diluting the waste before it comes in through, if we think about a barn, barns have like a flushing process, or they can have a scraped process. The flushing process to get the manure into whatever their manure management system is going to use a lot more water than a scraped system. So you want a little bit of water though, because if you're pumping it into your digester, usually we use pumps, a solid's not going to pump. So we need to think about how are we going to get it into our digester. So maybe we have to use a screw press or something else if it's too solid. Again, the agitation, the particle size, again, we can use a chopping pump that we can put in there so we can break up the particle size before it goes into the digester, and that'll help reduce some of the time needed for hydrolysis. Again, the sulfur content. If your feedstock has a lot of sulfur, then you're going to be producing a lot of hydrogen sulfide. And the sulfide bacteria, the bacteria that eat up the sulfide, they actually also take an acetate. And so the sulfur reducing bacteria compete for resources with our methanogens. So if we have a lot of sulfur, we might get less methanogens, less methane and more hydrogen sulfide due to that competition. We do need to think about foaming because there is some foam that's produced at the top of the digester. So we need to make sure we have ample headspace so we don't get foaming into our pipes. Again, we need to think about odor and rodents from the storage prior to digestion. Again, if you go on to a digester, what's great is it doesn't smell. You have all this manure and all this food waste and it's completely sealed up. And so it doesn't smell. But if we have rodents run, if we have a storage of something before, then we might have some odor coming from that. So again, if you think about the biogas itself as well, again, we're going to use it and we're going to combust it. So we're catching all those aromatics, all that odor is being caught in that biogas. And then as soon as we use the biogas, it gets destroyed. So we shouldn't be smelling anything. If we're smelling biogas, that means it's not being combusted and it's leaking somewhere. And if we're smelling we shouldn't be smelling the manure, or the food waste, or the sludge as well, because it should be inside that digester and that odor should be captured with the gas. We also need to think about toxins, cleaning supplies that are being used. Again, at low concentrations, it's not a big deal because we have plenty of bacteria, but at high concentrations, again, it really can and it really can affect the bacteria load, especially depending on the type. So again, even low concentrations of iodine may have an effect where you need larger concentrations of ammonia or formaldehyde. So again, we talked about the temperature range. Basically, you have a mesophilic digestion range. So that's going to be your 70 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Versus your psychrophilic, we still get digestion, but at a much slower time. So we might need a larger retention time. Thermophilic, again, 120 to 140 degrees. That's going to be much faster, so we can have a shorter retention time. So here we get most of our digestion within 20 days. With mesophilic, we may need a little bit more time. Again, by 20 days, we've got most of it, but we still have more if we could keep it in longer. But what we don't want is the biogas may be hindered by a lot of fluctuating temperature because again, the bacteria, just like our guts, are kept at the same temperature. They're much more happier when their temperature is kept constant. So again, we talk about what can go in. So depending on the quality of the organics, how much carbon's going in, we're going to get more methane coming out. Okay. So manure tends to have less methane potential. This is cubic meters of methane per 1,000 kilograms we put in because it's already been digested in the cow's stomach. So what's left over is the harder stuff to digestion that's not as carbon rich as putting in this manure, as putting in actually, alfalfa plants, putting in slaughterhouse, which has a lot of oil and grease, wood shavings, food scraps, canary grass, poultry litter, because poultry litter actually contains the shavings as well. It's the manure plus the shavings, corn stover, oat hulls, and finally food grease. So again, the more complex, think about the food, it might take a little longer to digest, but it has way more methane potential than the manure. So if we think about kind of the dairy, swine, beef, and poultry, there's certain animal units, there's certain chemical oxygen demand per that unit, volatile solids per animal unit per day in their manure, the percent of the manure that's actually collected, the conversion factor, and then the biogas that we might get per animal unit per day. And so we can see we actually, even though it's not as much, each animal unit at dairy, they poop a lot more than each poultry. So again, in a poultry facility, you might have thousands of birds in one facility. In a dairy, it might be hundreds. But again, if we think about it on an animal basis, so if we think about, we've gotten about 80 cubic feet of biogas per cow per day. But again, that can increase much more if we're adding fats, oils, and grease, or whey, which is kind of cheese processing waste. So converting this, if you can think about dairy only digesters that have about 1,200 cows, we can produce about 3 kilowatt hours per cow per day. But again, other people have set up to 5. And assuming we have about a 30% efficiency in our engine to produce electricity, then a 250 cow dairy would produce about, again, 20,000 cubic feet of biogas per day, and a 40 kilowatt generator would be suggested for that system. So you'd want to go through those calculations. Again, here is another study out of Germany. And here, again, they have their different methane yields that they got, with food grease and slaughterhouse waste and sugar beets being much higher than kind of our manures that are down here. So again, different studies, a little bit different results. And here they found for 80 dairy cows, they got about 5 meters cubed of liquid manure per day, which was about 70 cubic meters of methane per day, which was equivalent to about 13 kilowatts. Which was electricity for 5 houses, or heat for 1 to 5 houses. And then, but if you added those energy crops and you added food waste, then, you go from your 80 dairy cows now getting electricity for 280 houses, because again, we go from kind of 12 houses with the 80 dairy cows only to 14 houses, 140 houses, excuse me, when we add in these energy crops. And then when we add in, again, 10 tons per day of food waste, we're talking more about 280. So again, adding these more high value crops into your digester can greatly increase your electricity production. So here's actually, this is a German system. So here's the food waste that they collect. So all of this food waste gets collected from different restaurants. They go and collect it every day and put it inside their digester. And here's a study that we actually did. And here you can see this food waste being much higher. This is the liters of methane per kilogram of volatile solids. So for how much organic matter was put in, for all the organic matter, we got much more methane out of the food waste. Compared here, we have our grass silage and our maize silage, our corn silage, compared to 2 different types of dairy manure they had. And so again, it was increased by 400% or 270% compared to manure, as we added those substrates in. Here's another study here in Maryland, where again, they had different types of waste. So here they were getting, this one was post-consumer waste. So this is coming from restaurants and hotels and things. This was pre-consumer waste. So this was a cranberry factory, an ice cream factory, chicken meatball processing waste. And then they had dairy manure. And as you can see, these chicken and meatballs had way more methane potential than the cranberry, which was a little acidic. So it still did fine. And the ice cream, again, was very liquidy. And so compared to manure. And so again, way more, even though they had a lot more manure that coming into this, most of their methane actually was attributed to this food waste. Because again, anywhere 50 to 80% of the gas was produced in these first 12 days. And while manure only had 39%, it's just much slower compared to our food waste. And again, it had anywhere from 38% to almost 400% more methane potential than the same amount of dairy manure. So if we think about food waste and food waste diversion, again, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont have food waste films to methane. Mostly they were supposed to come into effect this year. I'm not sure if they're still there because of COVID. But with Vermont, it includes residents to source separate. So that food waste could go to food waste composting or could go to digestion. Again, there's some other cities that have had zero waste goals for food waste. But again, right now, there's not adequate facilities. We don't have as many compost facilities or digestion facilities to do those. But again, it can increase it a lot. But one thing that we do need to think about, though, is the nutrients from that food waste. It's great if we can use it in a digester, but we need to think about its nutrient management plan or wastewater treatment plant. That food waste nutrients is going to have to go through, it goes through the digestion process, then they separate the solids and the liquids after the wastewater sludge digester. The solids are laid onto the field as biosolids, and the liquids go back to the front of the plant and have to be treated through the plant. For a manure-based digester, the food waste that comes in, that food waste then gets applied to the field as part of their nutrient management. So it's great if they have the land and they need to grow the crops and they need those nutrients. It's not as good if they don't have that. So again, getting a waste like a Coca-Cola waste, which is just sugar, is great because there's not nutrients in it. If it's something like a meatball or chicken waste that's going to have more nitrogen phosphorus, you just need to make sure you have adequate land to apply that liquid fertilizer that comes out of the digester. And Again, food processing waste tends to be more uniform, easier to load. And again, if you think about Walmart has a sustainability index where, again, if you're, let's say, a meatball factory and your waste is going to a digester rather than going to wastewater treatment plants or a landfill, then you actually become a preferred customer, and they'll actually pay you a few more cents because you rank high on their Walmart sustainability, which is like a life cycle assessment index. Again, supermarket waste, you need to be careful. They might have rubber bands, plastics, and other things. And so normally we need a heavier grinder pump to grind these and make sure that we try to get any of those plastics and rubber bands off before. You can do depackaging systems. There's one farmer I work with in Pennsylvania that actually has a depackaging system, so he can get yogurts and usually they're expired things that come in, and then he can depackage them and put them in. So there is an EPA food waste locator tool. So this is a tool that's a GIS-based tool where basically it's the food waste opportunities map. So they look at where food waste is being generated, and then they try to map it with composting facilities and digestion facilities that can accept that waste, as well as looking at where it might be diverted if it's still edible. So, food banks. And so looking at the generators of the food waste, the healthcare facilities, correctional facilities, institutions, and then the recipients of this food waste, and they try to match those. So in terms of types of digesters, we can have a covered lagoon digester, which again just has the basic lagoon that you have, and you just put a cover on it for manure storage. So often these are not heated, and they may be mixed or unmixed. They're often not mixed. So that might be better for just manure. Rather, if you have food waste put in there, they may not get the mixing, and you might have some settling that occurs. A plug flow digester, this is what you can think of as being a long digester, and kind of what goes in. This is day one, it kind of moves through, and then each time the plug comes out the end. So on, let's say it's a 20-day retention time, then you're gonna have 1/20th of a plug in, and that's gonna kind of move through, and then the feedstock comes out. Tolerate some bedding, again, and you want it to not be too liquidy or you're gonna get solid separation. So you want it to move as kind of like a solid plug. You can have mixed plug flow systems. And so these basically will kind of be mixed coming through and then kind of do a U-shaped plug flow. And again, they're usually heated. And then you can have complete mixed digesters. So often for your food waste digesters, they might be complete mixed. And here again, you're gonna add in, and you're gonna hope that it kind of stays in for 20 days, but really kind of what comes in and what comes out, or 50 days or whatever it is, you kind of have an influent and it's mixed. And then you'll let it settle, and then it'll come out. So it's kind of an agitator and a completely mixed system, but it's really good for mixed feedstocks, and it can be mesophilic or thermophilic. Again, the potential benefits, it reduces greenhouse gas emissions. As I said, methane is about 25 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. And so by doing this, we collect it, and then we can combust methane to CO2. We can control odors. We can stabilize the manure and reduce wastewater treatment costs. So again, a lot of wastewater treatment is taking those biosolids coming from the process out to the fields. If we actually have a digester, we're gonna have a lot less biosolids coming out because we're gonna digest those solids and turn it into CH4. And so it actually reduces your trucking costs. And it can, again, reduce the amount of biomass going into landfills. Again, it has this a fertilizer that doesn't really have any odor. It's great. You can apply it into the field rather than having the manure on the field. And again, since it's already in the dissolved form, you have an increased uptake of manure, of nutrients after digestion, and it reduces the amount of synthetic fertilizers you need to put on your field. There are challenges. There's a lot of pressures. If we think about the dairy industry, milk prices, they may not have the money to put in these systems. Again, the US has little food waste separations compared to other countries. And so, and we have other feedstocks like poultry litter and other animal feedstocks that in Europe, they tend to like kind of co-digest everything together. But since we're so regionally specific, all the poultry litters over here, all the dairies over here, it's more difficult to have those things in close proximity to kind of do some co-digestion digesters, community digesters. Again, the importance of scrubbing that CO2 from, or H2S, excuse me, from the generator, especially for combined heat and power, so that we can reduce malfunctions of the generator. Again, if we're dependent on, for electricity, we're dependent on the price that our state is going to give us, or our electricity company is going to give us. If we're doing a small scale system and we're just using it for direct heat, we got to make sure that we're going to be using that heat all year long. Again, most treatment systems don't have an economic return, but this is a treatment system with an economic return. Septic tank doesn't have an economic return. Wastewater treatment doesn't necessarily have an economic return. This adds to that, but it may not break even all the time. Again, the digester solids can be used as bedding. And you can also get food waste tipping fees for bringing that in. But again, it takes time. We need to operate them. We need to find financing, cost share, and find those food waste contracts to come in. Again, we do have the opportunities. As I said, it's not intermittent. Without digestion, manure is a source of greenhouse gases, that manure management. Again, we can get these tipping fees and money to farmers. And again, we have identified these with available technology of 11,000 systems, but they're just not being built at the rate that other countries are. So that's digestion in a nutshell. Thank you very much.